Good morning and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. For those of you who heard yesterday that I was not feeling well, I'm feeling much better, but I am staying home today and working from home while I eat and build myself back up. This will certainly show my age, but I remember the very first Oh God movie starring George Burns as God and John Denver as a man named Jerry, whom God chooses to give God's message to earth. There's a scene in the movie in which God is seeking to convince Jerry to take on this task, and in Moses like fashion, Jerry is objecting and offering excuses. At one point, Jerry says, "I'm not even a member of a church." God replies, "Neither am I." Point well taken. God belongs to no particular church, but rather to all of them. It might even be better to say that God doesn't belong to any church. The church belongs to God. We are spending time this week talking together about how we find God in the church. There are many today who have abandoned formal religion and look for God outside the church. Well, where do we find God inside the church? The answer we will talk about today is in bread and wine. Let's start with a little history and connect a few dots. One of the distinct marks of Judaism is that they have a moment in time, a moment in their history that they can point to and say, God acted right here to save us. Of course, I'm talking about when God saved their people from slavery in Egypt. Jews can and do say that at that moment in history, God acted decisively to save them. And to remember that moment, God gave them a meal. When they share the Passover meal, they remember God and how God acted to save them. About 1,200 years later, God acted in history to save people in a new way through Jesus. And once more, we were given a meal to remember and renew this salvation. At the Last Supper, as they celebrated the Passover meal of salvation, Jesus instituted a new meal of salvation with bread and wine. This is my body. This is my blood given for you. It's a meal of forgiveness and grace and love. It's a meal that brings us God's real presence right there among us. We eat it with our brothers and sisters in faith, our faith family, so to say. In the very early church, whenever the people gathered together to worship, it was done in connection with a meal. The food was good news to the poor who needed something to eat. The banquet was in some ways a foretaste of the feast to come that they could anticipate in heaven with God. As part of all that, there was another meal as they gathered, the meal of communion and Christ's presence among them. When I meet with children to talk about their first communion, we talk about four words that all begin with the letter F that they can remember when they think about Holy Communion: food, family, forgiveness, and faith. We talk about the feelings we feel when we gather around a table, the warmth and joy of being together and the joy of the food. That's part of what communion is. We talk about the joy and warmth of being together with family. That's part of what communion is as we gather with the family of God. We talk about forgiveness and how Jesus died to save us. That's one of the gifts of communion, too. And we talk about faith and how Christ is really present in that bread and wine. That's what communion is, too. If you are looking for God, one of the most significant places to find God is in the meal of bread and wine shared with God's family. This very real presence, tangible with us, cannot be found by those looking for God outside the church. In fact, perhaps the best way to say it is that in this meal we share, God finds us. You may have heard me tell of it before, but one of my favorite moments in worship happens almost unnoticed. In our worship, we share the peace, ending divisions and joining as one with each other before we come to join as one with God in the meal. And then we sit and respond to God with our gifts and offerings, while the choir adds to our inspiration with an anthem. Meanwhile, while the offering is received and the choir sings, I go behind the altar and prepare the table for the communion meal. The first thing I do is take hold of the veil that covers the communion elements and lift it and fold it away. I love that moment because in that moment, Christ is revealed, unveiled among us. The body and blood of Christ is revealed, unveiled in our midst. It's dramatic and powerful, and it amazes me that the congregation doesn't gasp when the veil is lifted. We search for God, and in that moment, God is revealed in our midst. In bread and wine, God's family gathered around God's altar in a meal of food, family, forgiveness, and faith. In Christ present in our very midst, we are found by God. It's a gift you find inside the gathering of God's family. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.